Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Armed resistance has become trendy these days. Ukrainian fighters are lauded as heroes. Money is raised for them openly. Countries are competing to support Ukraine with weapons. The media is clamoring to promote it. And foreign fighters are volunteering by the thousands. National liberation and sovereignty suddenly became sacred notions. Blown up tanks and armored personnel carriers, shot down helicopters, captured and killed enemies, are counted and celebrated like the West is collectively scoring points in a video game. But it doesn't take a keen observer to discern the double standards applied to Ukrainians versus Palestinians. No attempt at nuance or context, no discussion of tit for tat, of on the one hand, on the other hand, is applied to the Russian war on Ukraine in Western discourse. If you don't view Ukrainians as heroic Scotsmen, led by their very own Mel Gibson, the brave Zelensky, fighting the tyrannical Russian king, if you dare to mention NATO expansion, Russian concerns repeated over 3 decades, you're excommunicated as a heretical Putinist. 1 year after Jewish extremists in Jerusalem provoked a defiant response from Palestinians in occupied Gaza, leading to Israeli war crimes, we see the same scenario repeating itself, with the Israelis attacking Palestinian worshippers at al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, executing Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and once again bombing Gaza, but without any of the sympathy expressed for Ukrainian victims or condemnation against their aggressors. In fact, the very nations most zealously supporting the Ukrainians are the ones supporting the Israeli oppressors of the Palestinians. Here to contextualize the latest Israeli escalation is Ali Abunimah, Executive Director of the Electronic Intifada and author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rania. It's a pleasure to be back.
And it's always a pleasure to have you on and get your amazing insight on all of the topics that I mentioned. And I guess a good place to start here is, maybe focusing on what's happening in Palestine with these Israeli provocations. The mainstream media, when they even bother to cover Israeli violence, they always start the timeline with Palestinian attacks, and they refer to any Israeli attacks as clashes, right? So I guess let's start off by setting the record straight. Of course, there's this permanent reason for the conflict, and that's the persistence of a settler colonialist state crushing the aspirations and dignity and freedom and future of the indigenous people of Palestine. So I just want to, note that we should, of course, never need to ask why Palestinians are violently rebelling against their oppressors. That's obvious. That said, over the last couple of months, we have seen a handful of Palestinians taking it upon themselves to attack Israelis. I think something like, over a dozen Israelis have been killed, which is quite unusual. And this is, of course, being invoked by the Israelis to essentially collectively punish Palestinians across historic Palestine. So, what do you attribute this sort of, I guess, latest wave of Palestinians basically hitting back?
Well, I think the thing that always amazes me is the patience of Palestinians and the fact that there is so little violence in response to the massive and constant Israeli violence against them. Israel is an apartheid regime. That should be uncontroversial now. But you can only maintain an apartheid regime, a settler colonial regime, and a military occupation using tremendous force, because it's not government by consent. Palestinians don't consent to living under this tyrannical Israeli rule. So they have to be forced to live under it. And that requires a tremendous, constant amount of violence. It requires constant killing, injuring, arresting, torture, home demolitions, keeping thousands of Palestinians in prison, political prisoners. And that's what Israel does. But for the so-called international community, which means, the West, basically, Europe and North America and its colonial outposts in, Australia, New Zealand and Canada and so on, this immense, enormous Israeli violence is just background noise. They don't even notice it. And it's only when, an individual Palestinian strikes back that all of a sudden there's all this condemnation. And we've seen that pattern repeated. Over the last couple of weeks, Israel has killed several Palestinian children in cold blood. I mean, just kids. Basically, there was a case of one child, Sanad Abu Atiyah, who was killed about 2 weeks ago. Israeli forces invaded his village. They shot another young man in the head. This kid, Sanad, went to render assistance, to try to assist the person who'd just been shot, and then Israeli soldiers shot him dead. And there was no outcry, there was no condemnation from the European Union, from Canada, from the United States, from the United Nations. They're all silent, completely silent. And this pattern is repeated. But when a Palestinian, and it's notable that several of the Palestinians who've gone and carried out attacks on Israelis have come from the Jenin area, because it's been a focus of intense Israeli violence in recent weeks and months. When they strike back, then all the statements come pouring out. We're horrified, we condemn, no justification for violence. And the message all this sends is that Palestinians are less human, their lives are worthless, and that Israel has a green light to keep killing them with complete impunity. And of course, now we're in the month of, in the middle of Ramadan, and Israel is escalating its violence, and it's particularly focused on Jerusalem and on the al-Aqsa Mosque compound. And as you mentioned in the introduction, we're almost seeing a repeat of what happened just about a year ago. And that's not a coincidence. There is a reason why the same pattern is repeating, and that is this is a deliberate Israeli strategy to try to use Ramadan and, of course, the Jewish Passover holiday, which this year coincided with Ramadan, to try to carry out further encroachments on al-Aqsa, and to use religion as a cover for settler colonial violence and an eventual settler colonial takeover of the al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is something that has been going on for decades, but we see intensifying now year after year.
Yeah, I just very wanted to put this up on screen. This is an image of the Israelis over the weekend, basically attacking the mosque during Ramadan prayers, Al-Aqsa Mosque, throwing stun grenades, as you can see. This is just one of many horrifying images that we're seeing of Israeli police just going insane, and people inside the mosque being attacked. And these images are so similar to what we saw last year as well. And so
Yeah,
go ahead. Well, I wanted you to elaborate real quick, because I think a lot of people are, they hear Al-Aqsa, they understand, they hear it's the third holiest site in Islam. It's an important site, but you mentioned colonialism. And I think it's important to understand what the Israelis are doing around the Al-Aqsa Mosque as a part of their attempt to colonially take over East Jerusalem. So can you explain what's going on at Al-Aqsa Mosque? Israel does seem intent on creating the same conditions as it did last year, which of course preceded the war on Gaza. So why is it that Al-Aqsa last year and this year has been at the sort of epicenter of Israel's violence in Jerusalem? And where does the, what's known as the Temple Mount movement fit into all of that?
Right. This is so important to understand, because, to the extent that there is ever any reporting on this in the so-called Western media, it's always placed in the context that, as if it's just communal religious violence, like, oh, this is a holy shrine and people just can't get along. And that's not at all the way to see it. Certainly, Israel is trying to turn it into a religious conflict, and I'll talk about that. But, those scenes we just saw, and there have been scenes like that every day. I mean, Israel attacking worshippers, beating women, men, old people who are at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound to pray. Last Friday, last Friday, almost a week ago from when we're speaking, they carried out a massive assault during dawn prayers on the second Friday of Ramadan, which is an important moment religiously for Muslims at Al-Aqsa. just a savage attack, tear gas, stun grenades, beating people. And the scenes we saw of them smashing, Israeli soldiers smashing the ancient stained glass windows of the mosque in order to shoot in tear gas. I mean, can you imagine if that was a synagogue anywhere? Can you imagine if that was a church anywhere? And the lack of international outcry, to me, is a sign of how normalized this violence is, not just against Palestinians, but against Muslims generally. And so now to step back and to give an answer to your question. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem, is, as you mentioned, often called the third holiest shrine for Muslims globally. It's also in occupied East Jerusalem, so it's occupied territory. Israel has no sovereignty there, no rights there whatsoever, none. This is occupied territory under international law. But Israel, and after Israel occupied East Jerusalem in 1967, immediately Jewish nationalists said, we must be allowed to go up there and pray, because this is also a site that Jews call the Temple Mount and believe that this is where the ancient Jewish temple existed, although nobody knows exactly where that temple existed. And what happened in 1967, after Israel occupied East Jerusalem, is that Israel's chief rabbis banned Jewish prayer at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, on the Temple Mount, as Jews call it, for religious reasons. They have theological reasons to do so, but it was also politically convenient because it avoided, in a sense, turning this into an even bigger flashpoint. But what has happened since 1967 and accelerating in recent years is that Jewish religious extremists ignore the prohibitions on praying there and try to go up there. And this year, as in previous years, even announced an intention to carry out animal sacrifices on the Temple Mount. Now, Israel and Jewish nationalists will claim, oh, well, how can Palestinians object to Jews praying there? Shouldn't everyone have access to a holy site? So they try to claim it's a religious issue, but it's not a religious issue because it is an occupied territory, and Palestinians can only understand what is happening in terms of Israel and its settlers using religion as a cover for a physical takeover of the site, an encroachment every year, trying to take another slice, another step forward in an eventual takeover. And the context for this has been the growth of something called the Temple Movement. And these are Jewish extremists. This is a movement that has become more and more mainstream in Israel. It may have started as a fairly marginal Jewish nationalist group, but it has become fairly mainstream in the sense that in recent years, mainstream Israeli politicians have given their support to the Temple Movement. Temple Movement organizations have received funding from the Israeli government and from the Jerusalem municipality, the Israeli occupation municipality in Jerusalem. And their goal is very explicit. It's to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to replace it with a third Jewish temple. And you could just imagine the just apocalyptic situation that would be. And Palestinian fears about this are in no way overblown or exaggerated, because there is a history here. In 1990, the Temple Movement, a group called the Temple Mount Faithful, announced a plan to lay a cornerstone for the Jewish temple. Palestinians protested, and Israel massacred them. Israel carried out a massacre, killing more than 20 Palestinians at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in 1990. and injuring many dozens of others. In 2000, Ariel Sharon, a deeply unreligious man, a man who was famous for not, being an observant Jew in any way, went up to the al-Aqsa Mosque compound under heavy military guard. This was in September 2000, a deliberate provocation that sparked the Second Intifada, the mass uprising of the Palestinian population, and eventually made him prime minister, because Israelis, the radicalized Israeli population simply loves this. And I'll just mention one other precedent that Palestinians look at and, in a sense, understand as a warning for what Israel intends to do at al-Aqsa, is what happened in Hebron in 1994, when an American Jewish settler from Brooklyn, Baruch Goldstein, machine gunned to death 29 Palestinian men and boys praying during Ramadan in 1994. This was in February 1994, inside the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, which is another site that Jews claim, a religious attachment to. And as a result of that, what did Israel do? Did it clamp down on the settlers and the settlements from which Baruch Goldstein came? No, it forced its way into the mosque and divided it in order to give the Jewish settlers, the Jewish extremists, their own part of the mosque. And so this is the precedent Palestinians fear, rightly so, in al-Aqsa. And what changed the equation last year was that as Israel was carrying out these attacks on al-Aqsa, and a similar massive dawn attack to the one we saw last Friday, almost a complete repeat of what happened a year ago, it was following that the Palestinian resistance factions in Gaza launched attacks on Israel in defense of Jerusalem. And this was historic. And that, of course, led to the escalation in which Israel began bombarding Gaza, targeting civilians, targeting apartment buildings, offices. Remember, the Associated Press office was bombed, the Al Jazeera office was bombed, the Al-Wahda Street massacre, in which Israel attacked residential buildings in the middle of the night when they were full of people, killing, in just that one incident in Al-Wahda Street, dozens of people, wiping out entire families. But also Israel was subjected to 11 days of bombardment by rockets from Gaza. Its economy was brought to a halt. Its airport was brought to a halt. And this changed the equation, because for the first time, the Palestinian resistance factions changed the calculations, in that Israel could no longer count on the resistance in Gaza remaining silent while Israel was attacking Palestinians in Jerusalem. This wasn't the first major Israeli attack on Gaza. Obviously, we've seen horrible massacres repeatedly over the past decade. But those Israeli attacks were always in the context of what was going on in and around Gaza.
Right.
The Palestinian resistance was always responding to Israeli violations of ceasefires related to Gaza. This was the first time they responded on this massive scale to Israeli attacks on Palestinians in Jerusalem. It wasn't, of course, just the attacks on the al-Aqsa, but also the attacks on Palestinian families and the attempts to ethnically cleanse Palestinians in the neighborhoods around al-Aqsa, including Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah and so on. So just to kind of bring us back to today, what happened today as we speak, or in the last 24, 48 hours, is that Israeli extremists, Temple Mount extremists, fanatical racists chanting death to the Arabs, planned to force their way through occupied East Jerusalem, have been planning even more provocations at al-Aqsa, and the Israeli government was forced to stop them because the Shin Bet, the Israeli secret police, warned that if Israel didn't control them, it would spark another war with Gaza. So,
Yeah.
which may yet happen. I certainly hope it doesn't, but it may yet happen. Even as we, by the time this interview is aired, who knows what will be happening? In the last 24 hours, we did see Israel bombing Gaza. We did see a couple of rockets being fired from Gaza, and that, so that even if Israel and the Palestinian resistance are not looking for an escalation, there is no guarantee it won't happen. And if it does happen, it will be entirely the responsibility of Israel, which just cannot stop itself from attacking Palestinians in Jerusalem and attacking al-Aqsa in the way that we've seen in recent days and continue to see.
Yeah, and while you were talking, I just put up on screen, this was the rally that you mentioned, the Death to Arabs. I don't know if you can hear that. They're chanting.
Yeah.
I mean, they're loudly chanting "Death to Arabs." But yeah, it was interesting to see the Israeli government refuse to allow them to go through Damascus Gate, because usually they allow them to because they don't want a repeat of last year, even though they still seem to be doing everything possible. But you mentioned Gaza being bombed, and yes, there was some rockets fired towards Sderot, I guess. And then you had, here's Gaza. This is from yesterday. We're speaking on Thursday. I don't know if this will come out on Thursday, but this is from yesterday. This is Gaza being bombed by the Israelis yesterday, overnight. So there is kind of like a war happening in the background. It's not full-fledged like we saw last year. But that said, I did want to ask you about the issue of Israel kind of has an all out of south. I also want to mention, you mentioned Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan. People are still being evicted from these neighborhoods. It's just not getting international attention like it was last year. You mentioned that there's Palestinians who've been killed. I think it's like over almost 30 Palestinians.
Yeah.
Up to almost 30 Palestinians have been killed across historic Palestine, basically by the Israelis, mostly in the West Bank. There's really an all-out assault right now. It's just contained to specific places, but it's not getting the attention it deserves. So even though the Israelis are maybe taking some measures to prevent Hamas from responding like they did last year, they don't seem to be trying that hard to prevent a war. And, Naftali Bennett was able to form this government. That's who's in charge right now, not Netanyahu. It's Naftali Bennett, who's like more right-wing, but seems maybe a little bit like less interested in a war than maybe Netanyahu might be. But they have the inclusion of this like United Arab List. I'm not sure of the details, but this group or this person, this politician, this Arab Israeli politician, if you will, is now threatening to suspend cooperation, which could see the government collapse. Though some have pointed out this is just, PR, that this was done in coordination with the Israeli governing coalition. I'm just curious, very briefly, what's the significance of this particular Arab party's inclusion in the Naftali Bennett government?
Well, in the history of colonialism, there have always been natives willing to collaborate with the enemy. In Lebanon, there was the South Lebanon Army.
Right.
Those were Lebanese who were willing to work with the bitter enemy of Lebanon, which had invaded Lebanon repeatedly and killed tens of thousands of Lebanese and Palestinians, and yet they were willing to work with Israel. And in that sense, Palestinians are in no way unique. In the West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority, which collaborates openly with Israel, so-called security coordination. Israel and the PA work very closely together. This is something I've been researching recently, looking at a lot of reports going back a few years where the Palestinian Authority even tortures Palestinians on behalf of Israel, basically. Certainly, some of the it's certainly likely, it's suspected, but it's almost certainly very likely that the Palestinian Authority has helped Israel to find wanted Palestinians that have then ended up being captured or killed by Israel. And within Israel, there is a Palestinian population. around 1.5 million Palestinian citizens of Israel who have the vote, who have the right to sit in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, even though they are second-class citizens in almost every other respect. And until the formation of the Naftali Bennett government last June, even though there were always a handful of Palestinians in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, their parties had never been part of the coalition. And so what happened last year was this small Islamist party led by a guy called Mansour Abbas. As far as I know, no relation to Mahmoud Abbas. It's just a coincidence that they have the same name. Joined the coalition, and that was trumpeted by Israel and its apologists in the West as, oh, how can you accuse Israel of apartheid? Look, they even have Arabs in the government now. But it's certainly, I think, something that is tenable only as long as there is a so-called relative calm, as there has been since last June. Not for Palestinians. I don't mean that Palestinians are living a peaceful life, but there hasn't been a major escalation as there was last May.
Right.
And so this party led by Mansour Abbas announced in the last few days that it was suspending its participation in the coalition, whatever that means, given that the Knesset is on break anyway. So, the government has lost its majority, but parliament is not sitting, so it doesn't mean anything. I think Ayman Odeh, the head of the Joint List, which is the other Palestinian group of parties that does not take part in the government, opposes the government, said that, suspending your participation in the coalition when the Knesset is not even sitting is like announcing that you're dieting during Ramadan, which I thought was a pretty funny joke, but also a pretty good analogy. But to me, last year when the government was formed, my analysis of it was, same axe, different executioner.
Right.
And that's the same. It really doesn't matter if Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid is in charge or whether Netanyahu is in charge. And who knows what the next period will bring. We may see Netanyahu back. We may see Donald Trump back. And for all the difference it will make, I think New York Times NPR liberals will be screaming. Maybe they'll oppose Nazis again.
Maybe it's possible.
Yeah, it's possible that if Trump comes back to office, Nazis will become bad again instead of heroes, as they're considered now.
And I actually want to get to that.
I don't want to go off topic, but
no, that's actually related. But continue. Go ahead. I do want to get to that though.
Yeah, but my point is that the makeup of the Israeli government is a sideshow. The anti-Palestinian settler colonial policy of the Israeli state is unwavering. The attempts to take over al-Aqsa, to encroach on it, to use Judaism as a Trojan horse and a cover for the settler colonial takeover of occupied East Jerusalem has been unrelenting and unwavering, no matter who's in office in Israel. So, this is just very much a sideshow. And I don't, the makeup of the Israel, the names, whose backsides are on the chairs in the Israeli cabinet room is of zero consequence to Palestinians.
And I just very briefly, because, the situation right now, I don't think a war will break out. I could be very wrong, but by the time this goes up in a day from when we're recording it, there could be another full-fledged war in Gaza.
The thing is, Hamas, which is not the only, but is the major and leading Palestinian military resistance organization, has made clear through intermediaries in recent days that it is not interested in a major escalation. And I think that, despite their, relentless aggression in Jerusalem, what Israel would like is they'd like to be able to attack Palestinians in Jerusalem and not have a war with
Response.
Gaza. That's what
Right.
they want,
Right.
So the Israelis will push as far as they can, short of, pushing for a full-scale escalation. So I don't think the Israeli government is looking for that in Gaza, and I definitely don't think Hamas is looking for it, or the other Palestinian resistance factions. The rockets which have been fired, there have been, 2 rockets, which is a tiny number,
Right.
and have not, have probably been fired by, sort of individual groups, not at the direction of the resistance, let's say. But these things have their own logic. Israel's relentless attacks on the Palestinian people may push things to a point, as they did last year, where the Palestinian people are demanding a response from their resistance.
Right.
And they say, defend us. We cannot allow these attacks to go unanswered, and the resistance will have to respond in a bigger way. And then things, follow their own logic. Israel will attack, and Palestinians will continue to defend themselves. And so these things can develop very quickly, even if ostensibly neither the Palestinian resistance nor the Israeli aggressor are necessarily looking for that escalation. And that's why this is so dangerous.
Right. Right. And I just want to note, before I move to some tangential points, that when it comes to the issue of Gaza, I mean, the Israeli policy on Gaza, I think, is best summarized by the Israeli demographer Arnon Sofer. You're very familiar with this quote, Ali. He's from Haifa University, right? Back in 2004, when he was advising Ariel Sharon's government to withdraw Israeli forces from within Gaza, and seal the territory off from the outside, but basically turn it into an open air prison, as has happened, and shoot anyone who tries to break out. He said to the Jerusalem Post back then, and I'm quoting him, when 2.5 million people lived in a closed off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will become even bigger animals than they are today with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. The pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. The only thing that concerns me is how to ensure that the boys and men who are going to have to do the killing will be able to return home to their families and be normal human beings. But I think that really encapsulates the Israeli policy on Gaza, which is to kill and kill and kill. Actually, it encapsulates the Israeli policy towards most of the various Palestinian, enclaves or prisons or whatever you want to call them they've created across historic Palestine. And so, they just, and their primary concern is how to continue to do that killing while having like the least consequences for Israelis. But, that said,
But
I do, oh, go ahead if you want to add
just
a
one
comment to that.
thing on
Yeah.
this that's so important, I think, kind of ties it together in a way. I mean, that quote from Arnon Sofer is horrible. And as you said, it was from 2004, but it was absolutely prophetic in the sense that exactly what Israel did has been doing repeatedly. 2008, the first big massacre, Operation Cast Lead, and then in 2014, and then actually 2008, 2012, 2014, then the Great March of Return, when Israel just massacred unarmed civilians, sent military snipers with high power rifles to murder children, medics, men, women, marching near the Gaza boundary against Israel's siege, which we have to remember is 24/7, 365 days a year warfare against the civilian population, which again has been so normalized, like the status quo of keeping more than 2 million people caged in this tiny territory sealed from the outside world is so normalized that as long as rockets and bombs aren't flying, nobody cares about it. Nobody says a word. The Palestinians in Gaza are kept on a drip feed by Israel, and nobody talks about that. But also, what happened last year, which really terrified Israel, was that during the May escalation, for the first time in generations, we saw a unified Palestinian response. So we saw protests and resistance and really a nationwide uprising that included Gaza, the West Bank, and Palestinians within Israel. And in the recent wave of individual Palestinian attacks on Israelis, in several cases, they have been Palestinians from inside Israel.
Mhm.
And so what we're seeing is sort of a reawakening of a unified Palestinian resistance and identity, given that Israel's strategy, very deliberate strategy to control the Palestinian population, has been divide and rule. You keep Gaza separated, you keep the West Bank separated, you keep the Palestinians in Israel separated, you stop them communicating, you stop them co-organizing, you give some you give some little benefits here and some little benefits there in order to keep people sort of preoccupied with their own concerns. And there were warnings in recent days, I think, again from the Shin Bet, the reports that I saw. I think it was from the Shin Bet or from one of the Israeli state agencies, saying that, if there is another war in Gaza, there'll be no way to prevent an uprising by Palestinians within Israel. So again, what we're seeing is the transformation of the confrontation to basically a nationwide civil war, in a sense, where it's the entire Palestinian population against the entire Israeli Jewish population. And that is a very dangerous situation, but it is also entirely characteristic of settler colonialism and apartheid.
No, that was very well stated. And, we talked a bit. So I want to move, not to make everything about Ukraine, but I think there are some intertwining topics or themes that I've seen with regard to what's happening in Ukraine, which is, of course, happening in parallel with Palestine. I mentioned earlier this sort of very, in your face hypocrisy, double standard, where there appears to be this very strong correlation between those who support arming Ukrainians with like anti-aircraft missiles to shoot at Russians, and then those who also support arming Israelis, the Israeli invaders, to shoot at indigenous Palestinians. So there's that hypocrisy. There's the hypocrisy about resistance, which is so in your face. Any Palestinian resistance is considered, condemnable violence, while when it comes to Ukraine, it's like we're just going to flood it with weapons so they can resist. But there's also a couple other things going on. And I think that is the weaponization, first of all, of Judaism with this conflict. Last month, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, addressed the Israeli Knesset, and he insisted that, like Israel, Ukraine faced this violent existential threat, basically, I guess, comparing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He also actually compared Russia's invasion of Ukraine to the Holocaust, which upset even Israeli lawmakers. And then meanwhile, you have the Israelis encouraging Ukrainian Jews to move to Israel, to make aliyah, as they call it, to become settlers. So on top of that, you also had the Joint List, I think, actually boycotted Zelensky's speech. And then there was a bunch of annoying American liberals who wagged their fingers at the Palestinians who boycotted the speech, saying, how could you do that when Zelensky was clearly attacking Palestinians in his speech? But all that said, how do you respond to the various ways that Zionism and Judaism have been weaponized in this war? And I'll also add to that the way that Zelensky has actually invoked his Jewishness to defend his alliance with neo-Nazi groups.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very disturbing. And I think for a lot of people, it's very confusing because I mean, first of all, as far, I think, we've talked about this before. I've certainly written about it. That, uh, a lot of people sort of instinctively made the parallel between, Ukraine was invaded and they're fighting back. So they're just like Palestinians. So
Yeah.
people who support Palestine should, instinctively identify with Ukraine. But uh, uh, Ukrainian leaders from Zelensky on down have made it emphatically and repeatedly clear that we should not identify Ukraine with the Palestinians. Rather, we should identify Ukraine with Israel. And we
Right.
should identify Ukraine's enemies with the Palestinians. And Zelensky even said that, after the war, Ukraine is going to be like a big Israel. That was the term he used. I mean, he didn't say a big Sweden. He didn't say a big South Africa. He didn't say a big, I don't know, Chile. He said a big Israel. That was his choice of model. And um, and he's not the only one. The mayor of Kiev has also said, among others, that that our model for defending our country is the Israeli Defense Forces. So they've been very clear about that. But the way that Zelensky's Jewish identity has been weaponized repeatedly, not just by Ukraine, but by many Western liberals who want to cover up and obscure what's happening in Ukraine, you know, because there is this strong far-right fascist and Nazi element in Ukraine, it's very hard to make the case. It's very hard to say, oh, we're defending freedom and democracy in Ukraine if the ruling clique and the dominant political strain in the country are fascists and allied with Nazis. It's very hard to make that case. So the talking point has been, oh, well, but they have a Jew for a president. They have a Jewish president. How could they be Nazis? Well, as if, Zionists and Zelensky is, of course, I don't equate Zionists and Jews. Absolutely not. But Zelensky is very emphatically a Zionist, a supporter of Israel, has never expressed any concern for Palestinians. And as far as I know, never expressed any criticism of Israel's brutality towards Palestinians. But there is a long history of collaboration between Zionism and fascism. So there's nothing that strange about, someone like Zelensky being in bed with these people. But even if Zelensky isn't, an emphatic supporter of these people, he has no power to go against the ultra-nationalist, pro-Nazi a trend that is in control of Ukraine. And I've had another talking point. Many people will have heard of the Azov Battalion, which is this openly Nazi battalion that is based in Mariupol. And I'll get this talking point on Twitter all the time, but the Azov Battalion is just a few hundred or a few thousand people. You can't tar a whole country of 40 million people as Nazis because of the Azov Battalion, even though this Nazi battalion is fully integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces. And that might be true if that was the whole story, but that's not the whole story. The story is that, or the reality is that the US-backed coup that took place in 2014 put in power people whose national hero is Stepan Bandera, the World War II Nazi collaborator, the Ukrainian nationalist Nazi collaborator, whose Banderite gangs were full willing participants in the extermination of Jews and Poles and others in Western Ukraine under Nazi occupation. And since the early 2000s, but especially since 2014, the regime in Ukraine has been erecting statues and monuments to Stepan Bandera honoring him as their national hero. One of the things they did in 2016 is they renamed the avenue leading to the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial, where 100,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazis in Kiev. They renamed the avenue leading up to that Stepan Bandera Avenue.
That's
Can you
disgusting.
imagine? Can you imagine that? So we're not talking about, the past, we're talking about the present. That,
Right.
what does it say? I mean, this is like if Berlin, decides to rename its main street after Adolf Hitler.
Right.
That
In
that's
fact,
that's
in fact, I
that
think
that
Stepan Bandera was like even maybe a touch too like insane for Hitler. Didn't Hitler like imprison him at some point? I mean,
No, it wasn't because that he was imprisoned by the Nazis, but not because he was too anti-Semitic or anything like
no,
that. It was
no, but
because he wanted Western. He thought he identified with the Nazis and wanted Ukraine to be given, to create to create a Ukrainian nationalist state allied with the Nazis. Hitler was not willing to do that because, Hitler wanted to absorb all of these territories into the Reich. He didn't want to create, independent states. So Bandera was interned by the Nazis for a period, but his followers were organized by the SS into gangs that carried out organized massacres of Jews, and
and
later
Poles
formed and
and Poles,
Poles,
yeah.
and later formed their own group, the so-called Ukrainian Insurgent Army, that was so brutal towards Jews and so enthusiastic and fanatical in its murder of Jews that, from contemporary accounts and accounts of survivors, and I wrote an article about this a couple of weeks ago. We can perhaps link it
Yes, of
in the
course.
description. That some Jews even went for shelter to the Nazis because the Banderite gangs were even more brutal than the Germans during this period of time. And so, because this is the reality, because this is the undeniable history, or apparently not undeniable because people are
Right.
trying to deny it, you even have Israel lobby groups like the ADL, and this was the focus of the article I wrote, who are trying to whitewash Bandera and his followers and to say, oh, their alliance with the Nazis was tactical,
So
as if that makes
crazy.
any difference.
Right.
First of all, it wouldn't make any difference.
No.
Secondly, it's not true. It was an ideological alliance where Bandera and his followers were deeply committed to, Nazi and fascist ideologies. But because the regime in Ukraine today views Bandera as a national hero, and the whole of the so-called West supports this regime, you can't square that circle. Something has to go. And so
Right.
what has to go is the history. What we have to do is whitewash and cover up and bury the history. So here you have a Palestinian who has to teach the ADL, the so-called Anti-Defamation League, which allegedly exists to fight against anti-Semitism, to school them about whitewashing Nazis and
Insane.
whitewashing Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera. But I see this all the time, on social media, where people say, "Oh, but Azov is just a few hundred people. Azov, But what about the cult of Bandera, the Hitler
Right.
accomplice, that is supported and elevated and promoted by the Ukrainian state, which was put in place by the US-backed coup in 2014. Are we going to talk about that?
Right, and it's also the issue of even if it's just a few hundred or a few thousand people, they have street control. They're powerful in the street, even if they don't necessarily run everything in the government, they are so powerful in the street that politicians are afraid to go against, or were afraid to go against them. Not only that, but I actually had on Tariq Surreal Amar a couple weeks
That was an
ago.
excellent,
Ye-
excellent, excellent
Thank you.
interview. I watched that and I shared it, and I encourage people to watch it because Tariq Cyril Amar, who is a German scholar, as I understand it,
Hmm.
and you know, and a strong critic of the Russian invasion of Ukraine,
Right.
goes through in that interview this history of the uh, the 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 cult of Bandera that has been uh, elevated and put in place since Ukraine um, gained independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And an important part of this has been the role of Ukrainian diasporas. This is
Right.
something I'd been aware of for some years and reading about that. These the Bandera after the defeat of Nazi Germany, many of these Banderites and nationalists were taken to the United States. You know that these were now
As many
uh,
Nazis were,
as many
shockingly. Yeah.
Nazis were, to the United States and especially to Canada, where they
Hmm.
kept alive the flame of Banderite Nazism. That's why there are all these monuments in Canada to the SS Galicia
So
division,
crazy.
honoring the Ukrainian Nazis who fought under the banner of the not fought, who murdered Jews under the banner of the SS during World War II, and the role that diaspora played in sort of reshaping Ukraine's identity into this ultra-nationalist, anti-Russia state, an anti-ethnic Russian, because remember, Ukraine has this huge ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking population. So
Right.
it's defining the state against its own Russian-speaking citizens and defining Ukraine as the anti-Russia, basically. Um, and so these diasporas played an important role after 1991. I remember reading an interview with Chrystia Freeland, who's now the deputy prime minister. I think last time I was on, I called her the deputy foreign minister, and someone
I don't know why I always think of foreign minister when I think of her too, but
she
it's a
used to
common
be the
mistake.
foreign
Oh,
minister, but she's
okay.
now, I think, the finance minister and deputy prime minister of Canada. And her grandfather was a notorious Nazi. Um, but she herself, I remember reading an interview with her from the early 90s when she uh, went to Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So she spent some time there. I think she was working as a journalist at the time. But I just mentioned that to show sort of the role of this
Right.
diaspora. And now, of course, I think that that that, and I don't want to, generalize, because there are certainly, many Ukrainians who may not support this, but these organized diaspora groups that have always been pro-Banderite and have celebrated the Ukrainian insurgent army and so on, and now a lobby. They are
Yeah.
sort of an analogy of the Israel lobby in the West, and so there are electoral benefits in Canada, particularly, but also in the United States. Chicago has a big Ukrainian population. There's a Ukrainian diasporic population. There's a uh, in the early in the mid 90s for a year or so. I lived in the neighborhood of Chicago called Ukrainian Village, which is
Ah,
historically where a lot of this diaspora lived. So they also function as a lobby, which is in a way analogous to the Israel lobby in terms of um, supporting policies that are also considered to be advantageous to US imperialism and
of
NATO
course.
expansion and so on.
I wanted to show this, you pointed this out. I wanted to show this screenshot from a New York Times article that you tweeted, I think yesterday. Because it's quite shocking. Uh You, of course, very sarcastically said the New York Times is continuing its long and hollow, actually, not sarcastically, honestly, said that they're continuing their tradition of whitewashing Nazis. And it's just incredible. I mean, they're talking about the steel plant in Mariupol, where all of these people have taken shelter as like their last stand, guarded by the Azov battalion. Uh, and the New York Times, for those who are just listening, writes clearing the plant could hold particular symbolic value for Putin, who has justified his invasion with the false claim that Ukraine is run by Nazis and that he is rooting them out. The plant's defenders include members of the Azov battalion, a force that does include far-right soldiers, some of them foreign, including white supremacists and people who've been described as fascists. I mean, like, how do you have those two sentences after each other? So it's a
Yeah,
false claim, but then it's not a false claim. Are fascists not Nazis anymore? Like, I'm confused.
yeah, and it's a sort of tell me they're Nazis without telling me they're Nazis. I mean, just like the pretzels they're twisting themselves into to try to like spin this and to to whitewash what's going on. And you know, admitting these truths doesn't mean you're a Putinist or you support the Russian invasion or you think that Ukrainian cities should be bombed. I certainly don't believe any of that. What I have said from the beginning and what I believe, and to the extent that my opinion matters at all, is that escalating the war is a catastrophe. And though I read a report yesterday. It slips my mind now where I read it, but the U.S. doesn't even know where all the weapons that it's sending to
The
Ukraine are
CNN.
going.
It was CNN.
Was it CNN? And already, some of the Russian Telegram channels I follow, they love posting videos of Russian soldiers with these hordes of NATO supplied weapons. That I've seen, for example, videos of Russian soldiers with hordes of weapons, these anti-tank, handheld anti-tank or anti-aircraft missiles that were provided by Sweden. It's clear the markings on them show that they're coming from Sweden. They've also claimed to have captured masses of British weapons and so on. And this also mirrors what has gone on so many times in the past, including more recently in Syria, where the US had to admit that the Barack Obama policy of flooding Syria with weapons meant that many of these US supplied weapons ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda linked groups and ISIS and so on. And I can't see any military outcome that will be of any benefit to the people of Ukraine. The only outcome would be a negotiated, peaceful settlement to the European problem. Europeans don't want to hear it. It seems that there's a war fever in Europe, and these same countries and governments that preach to the rest of the world, oh, dialogue and peace and normalization and war is not the answer, are now saying that for us and when our interests are concerned, war is the only answer. And there is no serious effort at diplomacy. And we've talked before, and it bears repeating, that the war in Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine, has its roots in NATO expansion. I think that's something that's unarguable. John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, has made the point eloquently. I watched, it's funny, this morning, I watched an interview with him on CGTN, the Chinese state, the Chinese
China state affiliated media, unlike
China
any American
state affiliated media, where he goes through this history. It's like this 25-minute interview, and you can find it on YouTube. Just search for John Mearsheimer CGTN, you'll find it. Really good, really thoughtful interview, but you have to go to Chinese media for it because US media will not allow any dissenting views or any kind of informed analysis like that, which gives background and a sort of in-depth understanding of the both the history and the dynamics. And the same, with the interview that you did with Tariq Cyril Ahmad, also a brilliant, insightful interview from a historian who spent his career studying these, studying Ukraine, living in Ukraine, knows this stuff inside out. But this sort of, and these are the sources, these are sources I learned from as well as reading. But this is not stuff that we're permitted to have in so-called mainstream media, and that's why we, people, I think, are so susceptible to just like the crudest propaganda, and then dutifully go up on Twitter to tell us how, oh well, Nazis aren't so bad.
Yeah, I know it. It's like a media dictatorship. And on the, you mentioned Europe and Europeans. So I did want to bring Palestine back into this for a moment, because I think that we could talk all day about the hypocrisy, but just seeing this in particular, I forget who he is. Josep Borrell Fontelles. Is he the foreign minister of like the EU? Is that his
basically
position?
he's like the equivalent of the EU foreign minister. Yep.
Okay. So here's the same man, days apart. One is a response to Israel's violence in Jerusalem. The other one is a response to Russian violence in Ukraine. So I'm going to read it for those who can't see it. This is the response. This was on April 15th. And I want to remind everyone who's listening and watching that, the past several weeks in Palestine, we've talked about an all-out assault. It's not just al-Aqsa, though that's a big part of it. It's also across the West Bank. We're talking about executing children. And just, generally people in general, anybody who seems like they might attack or whatever, just executing Palestinians under occupation, talking about bombing Gaza. And this is the response from the EU foreign minister. He says, "I'm deeply concerned by the clashes at al-Aqsa and by the many violent events of the past weeks in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. I call on all sides to act with the greatest restraint, particularly at this time of religious celebrations for three great religions." So this very middle of the road, both sidesism, calling
Clashes.
for all sides. Yeah. Clashes, right? It's clashes, even though it's like Israel on one side, armed, by the way, by the Europeans and the Americans, just completely stomping on Palestinians. So 3 days later, the same man about Ukraine says, "I condemn continued indiscriminate shelling of civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russian armed forces in Ukraine. In touch with the International Criminal Court prosecutor, hashtag no impunity for war crimes, working to support delivery of military equipment." So, I mean, you could not have two more different responses to what we're seeing. You could have, they couldn't be more different. On the one side, both sides, clashes, we call for restraint. On the other side, going to the International Criminal Court, saying war crimes before there's even an investigation. And also, we're going to keep sending as many weapons as possible to the Ukrainians. It really is astounding.
Yeah, and last year, almost at this time, a year ago in May, when Israel was targeting civilian residential buildings, as I mentioned at the beginning, massacring entire generations of entire families in their homes on video. No doubt about it. No doubt about what happened. We all saw it. We know who died. We have then, unlike in many of the incidents reported in Ukraine, by the way, where you'll see a report and then you'll never find out any details. You'll never see the name of anyone who was killed. All that stuff is well known in Gaza. It's not in any doubt. The European Union never condemned it. On the contrary, they defended Israel's right to bomb civilians.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is why you've made this point before, Rania, in a number of your interviews, that the so-called Western media, the so-called international community, likes to claim that the whole world is united in horror against what Russia is doing, and the reality is that much or most of the world has refused to go along with the Western approach to the issue. Most of the world hasn't imposed sanctions, even though the resolutions condemning Russia passed by large majorities in the UN General Assembly, by population, if you take the countries by population, the vast majority of the world abstained or voted against those resolutions. Right. And the point there is not that, to say, oh, well, that means that we should support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's that nobody's buying this. Nobody's right. buying that these countries have any right to lecture anybody about international law or human rights or killing of civilians, when these countries have participated in that for so long and continue to do so in countries all over the world that get no attention, whether it's been Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, the economic warfare against so many countries that dare to defy their diktats, and they just have no credibility and no moral authority. And those statements by Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign minister, are just so emblematic of why the world isn't buying it.
Right. And then I wanted to get, just a couple more things here, because I know I've taken a lot of your time, but I wanted to get your reaction to one other thing. And that is this right here. Sorry, let me keep us both on screen while we see this. This right here. This made me laugh, right? You saw this already, but I had to get your response to this, because I'm just like, speaking of people who just have it's like these people also just don't realize, they're oblivious. They lack any level of self-awareness. You have this woman who's the CEO she's a Jewish CEO of Russia's Google, right? And she's leaving Russia in this very sort of like, public way, where she says, and I quote, "I cannot work in a country that is at war with its neighbors." Okay. All right. But she's leaving Russia for where? She's leaving Russia for Israel. So she's leaving Russia because she can't work in a country that is at war with its neighbors.
Yeah, and probably Israel bombed Syria that same day.
Right. Israel's at war with every single one of every country, okay, except for Jordan, I guess, because Jordan normalized. But it's other neighbors. Israel's at war with two of its neighbors, and it's literally at war with the population that lives inside of it. Yeah. So it's just, it's mind-boggling, this level of like. And this is an article that they proudly, I promoted on the Times of Israel, but I saw other liberals in America sharing it. And it really speaks to, they live on a different planet. Like, they live on a completely different planet.
Well, it also speaks to the utter dehumanization of Palestinians in this particular instance. But over the past few weeks, since the war in Ukraine started, or let me use the Western terminology, since the Russia-Ukraine clashes began.
Right.
We've seen, these statements from sort of, Western liberal blue check types saying things like, oh, this is the first time we've seen war on this scale, affecting a civilian population in, since World War II. Those kinds of statements, which just completely erase the millions and millions and millions of victims of Western and American wars, millions of people. It's something that is so erased from our consciousness that that the United States dropped more bombs on Cambodia during the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. Which is what we should call it. We shouldn't call it the Vietnam War. We should call it what it is correctly, the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. The U.S. dropped more bombs just on Cambodia than the Allies dropped in the entirety of World War II. And the U.S. killed millions of people in Southeast Asia. Why is that outside our consciousness, so completely outside of our consciousness? And remember, of course, that the pretext for the American invasion of Vietnam was the fabricated story of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the US fabricated this claim that the North Vietnamese had attacked an American ship. It was a total lie. So this pattern has gone, is repeated and repeated and repeated. People of, our generation or younger are aware of the the lie about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. But these sorts of lies are used to justify every American war. There was the fabricated stories about Iraqi soldiers throwing babies out of incubators
Right.
in 1990. Then the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and so on, going back, decade after decade. So to me, that I've strayed a little bit from that CEO, but to me it speaks to the invisibility of the victims of U.S. imperial violence and Western supported violence. It's just that we don't see them, so it's not happening.
Right.
That's what it says to me.
So there's one last thing I wanted to get your take on, because I can't do an episode about this issue without touching on this. And that is, I mean, this is actually hilarious. So the MSNBC host or analyst, Malcolm Nance, in this very funny PR move, actually, revealed that he had gone to fight in Ukraine as a foreign fighter. Somehow he did this from a safe location at war, with like mic'd up for an MSNBC camera to go live, which, I mean, just tells me that he's actually not in harm's way at all. Anyways, this speaks to another issue of Ukraine, and this is another double standard that's maybe not entirely related to Palestine, although it kind of is, and I'll say why. The idea of foreign fighters going to fight for what I think is like a right-wing cause, and I think we can agree is a right-wing cause, a very imperialist cause in Ukraine from around the world, reminds me of Syria, where foreign fighters from around the world flooded the country to go fight, against evil Assad, and of course ended up, becoming ISIS, and that did not go well. But it also kind of reminds me of Israel, because, I mean, that's the other, military apparatus I can think of where people from around the world, based on some, in this case, a religious identity and an ideology of Zionism, go become Israeli citizens and join the army to, like, massacre indigenous people and kill people in Lebanon and Syria. So I just wanted to get your take on this new development of Malcolm Nance rushing off to Ukraine with his military uniform and his brand new gun that, I mean, looks pretty clean, like maybe it just came out of the box, to go fight on the side of the Ukrainians.
Well, what this makes me think about is that there are people in American supermax prisons, the kind they want to send Julian Assange to. And I think we should mention, this kind of publicity stunt isn't what a journalist should be, a courageous journalist does. I think what Julian Assange did, revealing American war crimes, is what a courageous journalist does, and he's being persecuted and punished for that. But there are others sitting in supermax prisons in the United States. I'm thinking of the Holy Land Five. These are Palestinian Americans who were sent to prison for 65 years by the Bush administration for raising money for charities, schools and hospitals in Palestine. Not even the US government claimed that they were raising money for weapons or for military resistance or for terrorism. The US government sent them to prison for raising money for schools and hospitals, which the US claimed was affiliated with Hamas. Some of those schools and hospitals had even been funded by the US government.
Right.
So if you could risk going to prison for life for raising money for Palestinian schools and hospitals if the US government wants to go after you, while someone like Malcolm Nance can pick up a gun and go to Ukraine. And we've seen other mercenaries. In fact, the analogy to Syria, it's not an analogy. It's a direct connection, because in at least one case we know about, this British mercenary called Aidan Aslin, I think his name is, who was captured in Mariupol by the Russians, had previously been a foreign fighter in Syria.
Right.
So he went from Syria. I don't know if he went directly. He may have gone back to the UK for a bit. he went from Syria, and then I believe he's actually been in Ukraine, in Mariupol, since 2018, and he was just captured by the Russians. But he had been in Syria fighting as a mercenary. So again, I mean, this publicity stunt by Malcolm Nance, I don't know much about it, but one thing we need to investigate or know, because these people are presented as, motivated individuals who just want to go and, do their bit for, whatever cause it is. But they're almost certainly being run by or being, sent in coordination and cooperation with Western intelligence services. We know, for example, that in the case of Libya, the NATO destruction of Libya in 2011, and prior to that, that British intelligence was involved in sending and bringing back British Libyan nationals
Right.
from Libya, who are doing the fighting on behalf of the West on the ground. And there was a recent report on French television where it was reported, a journalist who had been there said that, I don't know what evidence he presented for this, but that Americans were in charge on the ground in Ukraine. So, there's a long history of so-called US and Western military advisors who are
Yes.
involved in these proxy wars, because they can't be formally involved. The US Army is not going to be formally involved. So it all has to be done through these, off the books mercenaries and advisors and, shadowy outfits that we've seen, going from Libya to Syria and now apparently to Ukraine.
Oh, and I just want to add something about when you mentioned the UK intelligence services in Libya. One of the people that was like went to Libya and then came back, that was closely, his family was tied to actually British intelligence in the past for being anti-Gaddafi activists, actually ended up committing a terrorist attack.
Yeah, the
In
horrific Manchester suicide bombing at the Ariana Grande conference that killed, like, tween kids who are going to see a concert. Just an utterly horrific thing. And the whole connection of the bomber and his family to British intelligence was just totally covered up by the media.
Right,
You
because they
know,
don't want to have to
and
contend. Yeah, they don't
yeah,
want to have.
and we've said it before, and I think there's every reason to be alarmed and horrified by, what's going to be the blowback from sending Western white supremacists and
Mhm.
mercenaries to fight with Nazis in Mariupol or wherever, when these people come home to fight the race war in a Europe or in a North America where Nazism has been completely normalized again.
Right, exactly. We're seeing even like liberal attitudes have these like under the surface racist beliefs where you have these liberal journalists on TV talking about blue eyes and blonde hair. And that's the nice racists.
Yeah.
You could, and then you have the violent ones who are actually like going and, learning how to fight a war. It's like, what do you think they're going to do with those skills if they survive Ukraine? They're going to come back home and use them. It's actually the lack of concern for the potential blowback is so typical. And we're going to be dealing with this 5 years and 10 years from now and having a conversation about it then. But on that note, I'm glad that we could discuss all these really important issues. I'm glad we could get an update on what's happening in Palestine, and all of these things at the end of the day are completely related. Ali, can you just really quickly remind people where they can follow your work in Electronic Intifada?
Well, just search for the Electronic Intifada. My colleagues are just so brilliant. I'm proud of them, their work they do every day. You can find it at the Electronic Intifada. You can find me on Twitter at Ali Abunimah, excuse me. And yeah, and that's mostly where I am, just ranting away on Twitter most of the time when I'm not writing for EI.
Who isn't? That's what we all do. Ali, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Rania.